I want to talk about the meaning of life. And specifically, what I mean by that is I want to talk about the meaning of life. If we imagine that there was a hierarchy of human meaning and purpose, we could say that on the bottom there are subjective sources. And these subjective sources could be things like raising a family, being as successful as possible in one's career, or leaving the world a better place than you found it. But above this, we could say that maybe there exists an objective, universal, transcendent source of human purpose and meaning. And this is the specific human purpose that I want to talk about in this episode. But with that being said, the point of this episode is not for me to tell you what I think that purpose is. That would be crazy. Who am I to do something like that? Instead, what I want to talk about is the benefits that I have personally experienced in my life as a result of walking a pathway towards the pursuit of uncovering some answers about this capital T truth, you could say, walking towards what Plato calls the idea of the good, right? And specifically, these benefits that I have gained in my life are a greater understanding of my most true and authentic self, and a corresponding increase in the level of freedom that I have that then allows me to live in alignment and in accordance with that most true and authentic expression of myself. I know these benefits can be gained because I gained them myself. But living in the world in which we do, late modernity, it presents us with a series of problems in front of us being able to walk towards uncovering this greater purpose to human life. Specifically, there is a series of 4 problems that stand in our way that I want to discuss in this episode. And the first and foremost among those problems is the money problem. The money problem is the most prominent thing that stands in our way of living a life in accordance with our most true and authentic selves and the freedom to actually bring that into actualization. And the great tragedy is the vast majority of people never get to solve this problem and get to move on to the subsequent ones that continue to move someone towards a more free and authentic life for themselves. This progression of these 4 problems I want to talk about today, with the money problem being the first one among them, this is the only reason I know anything about money, right? And I'll have a lot more to say that as we progress through this discussion today, and I think it will become increasingly clear why I did everything I did in the past and what I would like to do as we move forward together into the future. Now, before we get into the heart of this discussion, I do have a few housekeeping comments I want to make. And the first thing is, this is a bit of a crazy topic, right? This is only my 2nd episode back after being away for such an extended break. Maybe we could have started off with something a little bit more chill, right? Maybe we could have started off with some lighter fare before we dove straight into the main course. But no, I very much wanted to start with this because, as we will see, and as I think will become very clear, my entire past is based upon this, and so too will the future be. In addition to that, I want to make it clear that this discussion about maybe a greater purpose of human life and why that might be a good thing for us to pursue, I want to make it clear that this discussion is not going to be overly new agey. It's not going to be overly woo-woo, but it's also not going to be overly religious or dogmatic. It's also not going to be overly materialistic or scientific. It's also not going to be a discussion where I want to co-opt things that touch on the metaphysical or spiritual aspects of life, and then figure out how can we turn those into things that make us more productive, right? There's a whole productivity crowd, and so they'll co-opt tools, things like meditation, and say, how can we use this to make ourselves more productive? That's not what this discussion is going to be about either. All in all, what I'm trying to say is I want to have a relatively normal discussion about this topic if we can. And I trust that most of you watching are going to be reasonable people who know that the internet is just a free market exchange of ideas. I'm not necessarily going to force my ideas upon you. You're not going to force your ideas upon me. We can exchange them freely. We can agree, we can disagree. We can take some things and leave others. In addition to that, this episode is probably best listened to. By all means, if you're watching it, you can feel free to continue watching me speak. No issues with that. But it's going to be pretty long form. I expect this conversation to take some time. So you might just want to settle into, listening might be the best way to go about it. And the reason I wanted to do it this way is because this is the way I tend to consume things these days. I want to hear what somebody actually has to say. I don't want to consume something in a bite-sized format. I don't want to consume something overly edited where you can kind of hide behind a lot of fancy stuff. I want to hear what somebody actually has to say about something, and this is what I actually have to say about this. So I basically just have some notes here with me, and other than that, it's going to be me speaking from my mind and my heart. And with all that being said, let's jump right into it. And the place that I think we should begin is the question of why. Why should we concern ourselves with thinking about or worrying about what may be a greater purpose to human life? Wouldn't it just be a lot easier? And, a lot of people are of the mind that maybe we should just focus on what happens to be right in front of us. After all, there's so much to worry about. We don't necessarily have the time or space to think about these bigger questions. But I'd like to tell you a few reasons why it might be worth thinking about. And the first of those is I see this question as the most interesting question you could possibly ask, right? It's the question of all questions. And so I think that's a pretty good reason to worry about it in the first place. In addition to that, as I've gotten older in life, I've realized the importance of having an internal value system. Everybody has a value system, whether or not you realize it, whether or not you're conscious of it, right? And your value system is going to affect how you move through life, what actions you take both consciously and unconsciously. For instance, you can think of different archetypes of people existing in the world. You may think of somebody who believes that there is no meaning in life, someone who is nihilistic. They might have a completely different internal value system from someone who's trying to raise a family and think about the future and future generations. And they might have a completely different internal value system than so-called DINKs, right? The acronym DINK stands for people who are dual income, no kids couples. All of these people might have different internal value systems, and that's going to affect how they move through life. Now, in terms of the construction of our internal value systems, I see how we personally either attempt to or make progress on answering the question of the purpose of human life. It acts as our foundation stone to our internal value system, right? Because it is the question of all questions, all the smaller questions in your life are going to be dependent upon how you answer this one. Everything else in your life is going to flow downstream from it. And so in that way, it acts a lot like the foundation of a house, right? The foundation of a house is only going to be as strong, long-lasting, and upright as the foundation on which it is built. And so I see our answer to this question a lot like the foundation for our own metaphorical house. And so for me personally, it has been very important throughout my life that I have continuously made progress on this question, because I didn't want to stack too many things on top of it right away, right? I wanted to make a good amount of progress on this before I started trying to stack things like money, aspirations, and relationships on top of my life. This idea, I believe, is also partly encapsulated and beautifully displayed by Plato's allegory of the cave, right? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the gist of it. If you're not, basically the idea is there's a group of people, they're stuck in a cave, they're chained up, in fact, and they're facing a wall in front of them. And they see these shadows dancing along the wall. And so, since they've spent their entire lives in this cave and they've been stuck in this position, these shadows are all they know. And so, they see these shadows as reality. They think of them as this is what life is, this is what is real. But in this thought experiment, one of these prisoners gets set free. And they stand up and they turn around and see that there is a flame behind them. And it is the flame that is casting the light. It is casting a shadow upon the wall. And so they understand that the shadow is merely the impression of reality. It is merely the impression of truth, but not actually the truth itself. And from there, they actually see that there is an even greater light leading outside of the cave, which is the sun, and the sun is symbolic of this revealing of truth, right? This revealing of the good, as Plato would call it. And so this person kind of begins their march out of the cave, but the sun is blinding. It's too much for them to take in. They've lived their whole life thinking this one thing is reality, and now they're having to adjust to realizing what actually is. And so it's quite difficult for them. But eventually they do make it out of the cave, and they see that there is an entire world out here. There is fields, there is grass, there is lakes, there's the beautiful sun, there's animals, and it's a wonderful world. And that this is actually the true nature of reality. And finally, this person then does return back into the cave to basically try and tell the others what they've learned, and they can't possibly understand. And to them, he actually looks a little bit like a fool, because when he comes back into the cave, his eyes don't quite fully adjust to the darkness, so he's kind of like bumbling around blind. And to them, he just looks like this crazy person, right? And they're like, no. This is reality. I don't know what you're talking about, right? And so the reason I mention it is because it's this idea of there being a corresponding progression between moving towards what you could think of as a capital T truth about who you are, what the world really is. And in addition to that, as you move towards that, you're also naturally just going to move closer to who you are, even on a personal, human level, right? And how you orient yourself in the world as a result, and increase your corresponding freedom as a result. You could almost think of it also in this way, right? And Plato also kind of has this thought experiment about the dividing line. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but you could almost think of it like this too, right? What I kind of mean by getting more and more in touch with your most true and authentic self is just even getting a greater understanding of who you are on a personal human level before we speak of maybe ontological truths associated with that. But what I mean by this is you hear me speaking, right? Or you're watching me speak right now. So you either hear my voice or you see my body or some combination of the two. And to you, this is who the identity of Stephen is, right? That's who Stephen is to you. It's what you can physically observe. But me, I have a deeper understanding of who Stephen is than you, I think we can reasonably say, right? That's because I am Stephen. I inhabit this identity of Stephen. In fact, Stephen is this identity that exists inside of my consciousness, right? I can hear his voice inside of my head when I think thoughts. I can feel emotions that I associate with this identity of who I am. And so it's fair to say that if we think of as your conception of Stephen as a small t truth, then my conception of Stephen is probably a little bit bigger of a T truth. And eventually, as we kind of peel back the layers like an onion here, we're going to be moving closer and closer to what the most true and authentic form of Stephen truly is. And so this progression towards truth inevitably brings you more into a deeper understanding and alignment with the most true and authentic version of yourself. And so, this is why I think it is very much worthwhile to concern ourselves with this question, right? Not to mention that we probably live in the most interesting time possible to attempt to answer this question. We have thousands of years of spiritual tradition behind us that have been attempting to answer it, and now we have hundreds of years of using the scientific method to also try and answer ontological truths about our reality. And the very interesting thing is they're both beginning to converge upon some of the same answers. And I think that's pretty cool. So all in all, if we want to live a life that is most in accordance with our true and authentic selves and have a corresponding level of freedom to actualize that, to bring that into existence, to live our lives that way, which, by the way, is one of the most common deathbed confessions, is that people don't get to do that, right? There's a big problem with actually making this happen. I'm saying it's very worthwhile to do, but we have a lot of problems trying to prevent us from being able to do this. And so I'd like to go through a number of those problems. The first one is just general fear, right? And it makes sense. Thinking about what happens once we die, if we actually maybe have something like a soul. All of these big questions can be a little bit too much, right? We have so much to worry about in just our mundane lives. It's often better just to, live in a little bit of comfortable ignorance, right? Ignorance is bliss in that regard. And I totally understand that. I think that's totally reasonable. Another issue standing in the way is I think we don't, in today's world, in late modernity, I think we don't quite know how to actually approach answering this question anymore. And that's because this question kind of exists in this weird vacuum right now. And the reason it exists in this weird vacuum is because for the past several hundred years, since basically the late stage of the Roman Empire, one religion has dominated the entire course of the Western lineage of civilization, right? All the way up until, well, basically the Enlightenment era was kind of one of the major turning points away from it. But nonetheless, one religion, Christianity, dominated much of the course of the Western lineage of civilization. And so it provided people with an answer to this question. But now as we have moved towards secularization, which I'm not saying is a good or bad thing, I'm just saying it is, this just is a fact. As we have moved towards secularization, we've also left this vacuum where we don't quite know how to approach answering this question anymore. So that's another issue standing in our way where we might think, you know what, I'm just not going to worry about it. In addition to that, just the general struggle of our lives hold us back, right? Because of the demands, especially from work, right? Our relationship with work, which is something I'm going to talk a lot about, especially as how it relates to solving the money problem. it puts such a demand on us that we do not have the time, capacity, or space to even think about this, right? It's the least of our concerns. In addition to that, the abundant world we live in today actually can serve as a source of distraction or deterrence from thinking about such big questions. And one example of that is you've probably heard of the quote unquote attention economy, right? And that's because some of the most profitable businesses today are designed on commoditizing attention. I mean, think of where you're even watching or listening to this, right? These platforms commoditize attention, and that's how they make money. And so I'm not saying necessarily that that's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying it's something to be aware of. There are many things to be aware of as we navigate this time in which we live of late modernity, where our attention and our time and our energy may be being sapped away from us. So there is nothing left to give to these greater things. Now, all of this leaves us in a position where without an answer to our foundation stone, right? Without an answer to our foundation stone, we are kind of like a bag in the wind, floating this way and that way, based off how we might feel in a particular moment, or based off what other people might happen to be doing. We never get the opportunity to know our true selves or the true world. And I see that as a great tragedy. In other words, we are stuck in Plato's cave. So then, what is the solution to these problems? What is the solution to these problems? Well, I looked back on my life, and with the hindsight of 2020, I was able to look very clearly at what I had done to overcome these very specific obstacles and to live in accordance and understand my most true and authentic self and have the corresponding freedom to actually actualize it in the world. And with the 2020 of hindsight, I was able to basically compile everything I learned and did and basically put it into a system. And the system is something that I call the sovereign stack. And the idea is that it's a stack of information that when combined together can move someone towards this end goal of knowing and understanding their most true and authentic self and being able to have the freedom to actually bring that about over the course of their lives. In other words, it's very much about a progression of freedom and getting in touch with ourselves so that we can have the space to think about these bigger questions and who we truly are. And this is something that is so important to me. This is something that I've been doing my entire life and that I want to continue to do for my entire life. In many ways, I see this as my life mission, to understand what the hell is going on here. I mean, right? I see this as almost everyone's birthright, right? If you're born human and alive, you have the right to know why. You have the right to know what is going on here. And so again, the goal of this discussion is not for me to tell you what I think the meaning of life is. The goal is to share with you the pathway I have carved for myself so that hopefully I and we can continue to discover what that meaning is for ourselves and be the captain of our own lives, our own souls, if you will, as a result, instead of being bags flapping around in the wind. So then, what exactly is the sovereign stack? How does it work? Well, as I alluded to earlier, it deals with tackling these four main problems. The first one I mentioned earlier, which is solving the money problem. All four problems go as follows. Solve the money problem, solve the body problem, solve the mind problem, solve the soul problem. Now, how did I actually compile this? And I think this is very important to talk about. I looked back on my life and everything I did prior to YouTube. Okay, I want to be very, very clear about that. Everything I'm talking about has to do with my life before YouTube was even in the picture. This is not some journey I'm going on now that I have increased, that now that my career is different. Okay, this is not like some awakening thing I had where, now I'm going off on this. No, I want to talk about what I was doing specifically when I had a normal job, relatively normal life, because I believe that, because that's when I transformed myself and my life using this sovereign stack idea, right? And I think that there's not really going to be any value in me talking to you about, things that are only applicable to someone who has a life like mine now. That doesn't make any sense. You're going to get value out of me discussing specifically things that I did in the past when I had a normal job, a normal life, and how I used this to bring about the most wonderful and beautiful and honestly indescribable changes, both to myself and my life as a result. And I can talk about this and see this clearly now that it's sufficiently in the rear view mirror. That's why I want to and can talk about it now. And to be clear, all of this has been a lifelong thing for me, right? Since I was very, very little. I've always, always, always been concerned with this stuff, this question, and have very intentionally directed my life in such a way to make progress on all of this. All right? So again, the point of this video is to say that I think we all deserve to have the ability to make attempts to answer the purpose of life. I see it as our birthright to know the purpose of our existence, and in doing so, we can then clearly direct our lives from this foundation stone we have for ourselves, and we can understand ourselves, right? But in order to get there, there's this series of problems in the way. And so to get there, we need to be free. We need to be independent, right? In an independent position as it relates to our money, as it relates to our bodies, as it relates to our minds, and then finally, as it relates to our souls. So then let's talk about actually solving these 4 problems. Let's talk about how to move towards being a more free and authentic human being, having sovereignty over ourselves in a world that seeks to strip it from us. So the structure of the stack goes something like this. Let's say that the ultimate goal of life is to uncover capital T truth, or to move towards the idea of the good, as Plato would call it. Now that's just like a placeholder goal. It's going to, you can insert whatever particular highest goal you think is the one that makes the most sense, right? But let's just say there is a highest goal, something as it relates to ontological truth, as the top of this structure. Then in order to get there, in the era in which we live, in late modernity, in order to get to this capital T truth, first I believe we must self-actualize ourselves. And what I mean by that is, if we imagine a mountain, okay, and we're climbing this mountain, but we can't see anything. And the reason we can't see anything is because the entire area around us is shrouded in fog. It's shrouded in clouds. So the only way we're going to be able to see anything is we have to keep climbing. And eventually we reach the top. And once we reach the top, we have broken above the cloud line and we can see a vast expanse in front of us, right? This kind of parallels the idea of Plato's cave. The top of this mountain is self-actualization, and the clouds represent all the struggles and problems that living a life in modernity presents us. When we can overcome them and reach the peak of self-actualization, we are then in a space free of body, mind, soul, money, where we can then direct ourselves to being able to make progress on thinking about and answering these very big questions, right? Okay, so then what specifically is self-actualization, though, right? Because it sounds like a little bit of a vague concept. So to provide more color on what self-actualization actually is, we can look to something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Not going to reinvent the wheel because Maslow's hierarchy of needs spells it out pretty good, in my opinion. And so probably a number of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is essentially this pyramid. And this pyramid has 5 levels to it, each level representing a source of human need that must be met in life. And the idea is that as you solve one particular need, you're in a better position to then move on to the next one. And the ultimate goal is for you to climb the pyramid to the top. So the first level on the bottom of the pyramid represents physiological needs. These are the things that are the most essential base needs for your survival. So this would be things like air, food, water, shelter, sleep, that type of stuff. Now, one level above physiological needs is safety needs. You can think of this as what provides you access to your basic physiological needs, right? So safety needs would be things like personal security, employment, a job, money, right? Resources, health, and property. They're what provide you access to your base physiological needs. And very importantly, right, we're starting to see where money comes into the picture here. We're starting to see where our relationship with work is going to come into the picture. This is very important to pay attention to. Now, as we move to the third level, it is love and belonging. So this would be things like friendship, intimacy, family, a sense of connection. Now, another thing to note is our first 2 needs were very much physical needs. But now we're starting to progress into a bit of a different realm here, right? We're starting to progress into a more metaphysical realm, you could say, right? A realm of emotion, or a realm of specifically having to do with our conscious experience, right? Which would be a metaphysical thing in nature. One more above that, we continue to get deeper and deeper into this realm, because the 4th rung on the pyramid is esteem needs. So this would be things like respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, and freedom. Now finally, the very capstone of this pyramid is self-actualization. And self-actualization is what I have been talking about in this video throughout it. And that is the idea of understanding and then living in accordance with your most true and authentic self. As you climb this hierarchy of needs, you get put into a better and better and better position to be able to do this, right? Does that make sense? So the idea of we must self-actualize before or along the progression towards moving towards capital T truths, or the idea of the good. And an interesting thing here that kind of shows this dynamic is that for us, quote unquote normal people who choose to participate and live in society, you could say, we have a very different progression than, say, somebody who only chooses to walk the spiritual or metaphysical or philosophical path in life. For example, somebody who becomes a renunciate and exists as a temple dweller. That person is going to basically skip all the way to the top of Maslow's hierarchy. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to refuse to engage with basically a whole bunch of these needs, right? They're going to meet their basic physiological needs, But beyond that, they're going to refuse to engage with things like money, jobs, intimate relationships, status, competitions, and so on. And so through this, by refusing to engage with them, they kind of circumvent being able to, they circumvent Maslow's hierarchy and basically go straight to the top and go straight to the pursuit of capital T truth, which is interesting. But for everyone else, for us, right, who want to participate in society, we have to go through this series of progressions, specifically starting with the money problem, right? Because if we think about, okay, so we know we want to climb Maslow's hierarchy because the pathway towards ontological truth is we have to first achieve self-realization. Okay, how do we achieve self-realization? We climb Maslow's hierarchy. Okay, how do we climb Maslow's hierarchy? The most simple way is with this sovereign stack idea. It's to solve these 4 problems. So let's talk about those now. The first one, as I've said, is solving the money problem. This is the first problem that we must solve because money controls our lives. And what I mean by that is money acts as the labor allocation layer of society. And what I mean by that is money is what forces us to work, right? Why do we work? We work because we need money. Why do we need money? We need money because money is the way we access the things we want and need in life. Therefore, we have to work. And by have to, I mean have to, right? And to obtain the necessary amount of money for the things we need and want in life, it results in us having to rent out our bodies and or our minds for the majority of our day, for the majority of the days of the week, for the majority of our adult lives. And in fact, prior to our adult lives, our childhood, teenage years, and adolescence is basically spent preparing us to enter this, right? To enter the workforce, as they call it, right? So your whole life is preparing you to enter into this arrangement. And therefore, the need to obtain money basically controls your life. Now, this arrangement ends up causing us a big problem here. And that's because most likely the way you obtain money involves you having to do a set of actions that is misaligned with the most true and authentic version of yourself, right? And what I mean by that is, say we imagined a world where money didn't exist, and yet we also still had the abundance that we do in late modernity. It's just a thought experiment. Don't get all pissy about this. I'm not saying this is actually possible. I'm just saying it's a thought experiment for the purposes of this discussion, right? So don't go crazy. Let's say money didn't exist, but we still had the abundance that we do. In that world, where you could freely choose how you wished to provide value to society, you could say, would you be providing value to society the same way you're doing it today? In other words, would you be spending every Monday the same way you spend it today? Probably not, right? For some of you, the answer might be yes, and that's really cool. For me, the answer is yes. But it wasn't always. It definitely was not always. I had to solve this, series of 4 problems to be able to do that, and that's why I'm talking about it. So I think it's reasonable to say probably for most people, they don't spend their Mondays exactly the way that they would choose to if they genuinely had a free choice, right? And so that's a problem, because if this set of actions that you do every day at work is misaligned with your most true and authentic self, then that means that for the majority of your day, for the majority of the days of the week, for the majority of your adult life, you are misaligned from your most true and authentic self. And so in totality, it really means that you are not living as yourself. You are not living the life that you would choose to if you actually had genuine free choice. And I think that is a great tragedy, right? And as I said earlier, this is one of the most common deathbed confessions that people have. They wish they were able to live their life as themselves. And the reason they couldn't had to do with their relationship with work, since it dominates their life so much. So most people never solve the money problem. Solving the money problem is the way out of this. But because most people don't get to, or they only get to at a very late stage in life when it's arguably too late, they never get to move on towards solving any of the other subsequent problems. And so they have this big problem, or so they have this big disconnect on the road to self-actualization because they have this major misalignment with their most true and authentic self, right? How can someone possibly achieve self-actualization if what self-actualization is, right? The very thing that self-actualization is living in accordance with who you are. And if you spend almost all your time not living that way, how can you possibly achieve self-actualization? You can't. And the reason you can't is because of the money problem. Again, this is the only reason I know anything about money, right? Money by itself is nothing. It's a symbol. It's a medium of exchange. It's nothing. Right? And the lifestyle around money is just so around like money and luxury and all. It's just so lame. It's just so goofy and lame. I don't know about money because I think it's really interesting or because, I want that type of lifestyle or anything like that. I want to solve the money problem because it's the first door we got to break through to even begin to move towards a place where we can be true and authentic versions of ourselves, right? Does that make sense? Because of the world in which we live, because of late modernity, because of the vast expanse of history behind us that has resulted in our relationship with work today, which, by the way, I'm actually writing a book exactly about that, and that's what I've spent a lot of time while I was away researching and writing. And if you're watching this sometime in the future, months in the future, I'm publishing this probably sometime in June of 2025. If you're listening to this or watching this sometime well beyond that, check the description in case there's a link for said book if you do want to check it out. But basically what I'm saying here is solving the money problem equals financial independence, right? This is why I created Cash College. This is why I spent so much time talking about financial independence. I was dipping your toes into this. Now I'm throwing you off the boat and we are going swimming. All right? Solving the money problem equals financial independence. But it doesn't have to equal retirement level financial independence, right? Because what is financial independence? Well, financial independence is the thing that people achieve when they retire. And a lot of people think, well, retirement is an age. No, it's not. It's an ability. And the ability you achieve at the point which you retire is financial independence. We associate it with an age because that happens to be the general time when most people achieve this ability because of the way the labor allocation system is constructed. It's designed basically that you achieve the ability of financial independence at the point which your utility to the labor force greatly starts to decline, right? It all makes sense. There's a quote, the point of a system is what it does, right? If you want to understand the purpose of something, just look at the outcome, right? Makes a lot of sense. So you don't need to achieve retirement level financial independence to solve the money problem, though, right? Because that's a very hard thing to do. It's very hard for most people to achieve that very early in their lives, right? To achieve early retirement. It involves a very big trade-off for most people's lives that I don't think is quite worth it. I think instead, trying to achieve something like temporary financial independence is much, much better, because you can achieve temporary financial independence that you can then use to buy you a window of time where you can then attempt to understand and then align with the most true and authentic version of yourself. And that's exactly what I did earlier in my life, right? When I quit my first job, that was exactly what I was doing. I temporarily solved the money problem for myself, and it was the first door I unlocked that led to changing everything in an indescribable manner, right? That's why I'm trying to place so much emphasis on this. Does that make sense? Hopefully. And if not, we're going to talk a lot about solving the money problem in subsequent episodes, so don't worry. But for now, I want to move on to covering the entire system, as it were. And so we'll move on to talking about the body problem. Now, this problem and the next, so the body and the mind problem, can actually be solved together. And in fact, all three of the first problems, money, body, and mind, can be solved in concert with one another. And in fact, it may even be more powerful to solve them in concert with one another. And that's exactly what I ended up doing too. So then, okay, what is the body problem exactly? The easiest way to think about the body problem is our bodies are the conceptual containers for our minds. And what I mean by that is our bodies are the literal containers for our brains, right? Our brain is literally, physically inside of my body. But we conceptually also place our mind inside of our body, right? It seems to me that my mind, or my conscious perspective, right? It exists in the center of my head. It feels that way. It appears that way. We perceive it that way. But if we were to try and actually physically locate my mind, right, this conscious experience I'm having, we wouldn't be able to find it. You can't find your own conscious field in physical reality. And so in that way, what I mean is our bodies are the conceptual containers for our minds. And if they are the containers for our minds, then solving the body problem means to cultivate our bodies in such a manner that it provides the environment that is most conducive to the proper development of our minds. If we were to imagine our bodies as a garden and it was the soil, we want to properly cultivate the soil so that our mind can bloom into a beautiful flower. Does that make sense? Now, it is a problem. It's always been a problem, this cultivation of the body, but specifically in late modernity, it is very much a problem because all of the forces of modernity are basically acting upon us to pollute our bodies, right? Think of the food we eat. Think of the literal pollution that is out there. Think of all these, think about even just trying to do very basic things like sleep. Think about all the artificial lights and sounds that exist in modernity that make it hard even to just do something as simple as sleep. Think about how to exercise ourselves, to move our bodies properly. We have to artificially do it. Have you ever thought of how silly a treadmill is? An artificially moving ground that we can simulate the experience of running on, or lifting weights. We've just made a heavy object specifically for the purpose of picking it up and putting it back down. These artificial forms of movement that we have to find the time to do so that our bodies just don't deteriorate because of the way we live today. These are the things that I'm talking about, right? These are the problems that are presented to us in the body problem that are obstacles in the way of us properly cultivating it. Now, I'm not going to get into the specific practices and protocols that someone might want to follow to cultivate their body, but in essence, the basic things that we want to regulate are things like sleep, diet, exercise, drug and alcohol use, even our speech, and sex. Now, similarly, when we are speaking about the mind problem, it's very similar to the body problem. And that's because if our bodies are the conceptual containers of our minds, then our minds are the conceptual containers of our souls. And what I mean by that is, okay, we have established that there's this conscious field, right, that seems to exist inside of my body somehow. But then within this conscious field, within my mind, there seems to be this identity, right? There seems to be this thing that I think of as myself. There seems to be this perceiver who's like a witness to what's happening in my mind, right? Because what is inside of our mind? Well, our mind is a conscious field that's populated by our 5 sensory organs or experiences, right? It's populated by visual sensory data that comes in through my eyes, and then my brain turns it into what is my visual experience inside of my mind. Same thing with every other sense. That's what our mind is. But there's someone or something, or right? There's me who's viewing all of this. And so in that way, we might think of that as some version, maybe the lowest version of, perhaps, our souls, right? And so in this way, our mind is the conceptual container for our souls. And if that is true, then it means that just like our bodies, we have to create an environment in our mind that is most conducive to the proper development of our souls. And again, similarly to our bodies, modernity presents all of these obstacles and trials in the way of us being able to do this proper cultivation, right? Think of here's a very simple way to think about it. Think of the phrase, you are what you eat. When we apply that to physical food, that phrase takes on a very literal and tangible meaning, because when we eat food, what happens? Well, it goes down into our digestive system, then it gets broken up into components that are carried throughout our body by our blood and our circulatory system, and from there our cells intake those building block components and use it to regenerate and replenish themselves. And so, in a pretty literal manner of speech, we are what we eat, right? Physically. But what about mental food, right? What about what we consume mentally? What about the things we listen to, the music we listen to, the podcasts we listen to? What about the things we read, the information we take in, the experiences we have, the conversations we have with people? What about all of that? Well, that also gets fed into our mind's digestive system, you could say, right? Gets fed into our subconscious mind eventually. And then in there, it kind of gets fed into this circulatory system of sorts, which you could maybe think of as the default mode network in our brain that cognitive science has found. Our default mode network essentially acts as our autopilot system of our brain. And the very interesting thing about this default mode network is it is what is in control of us for the vast majority of our waking time. It is directing our thoughts, patterns, and behaviors, our autopilot system. And so in many ways, this autopilot system is us, or at least some version of us. And so what gets fed into this then too becomes us in some way, right? And so the essence of cultivating our minds stems from that idea of we are what we eat mentally too. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the specifics of practices and protocols in this particular video because these are their own big conversations. But one thing you might have noticed, if you happen to watch videos about subject matter like this, or listen to things like this, these body and mind practices seem to resemble what a lot of the kids these days are calling monk mode, right? And that's because it very much does. This is very much what that is. But monk mode is not a new thing, right? This concept of following a specific practices as it relates to our bodies and as it relates to our minds so that it leads to both physical and metaphysical benefits in our lives. This idea has been continuously converged upon since the recorded history of humanity. That's because monk mode is not an accidental terminology. Monk is used because these practices stem from spiritual tradition, right? And if you want to see two very general examples of that, you can Google the Noble Eightfold Path if you want a Buddhist perspective, or you could also Google the 8 limbs of yoga as defined by Patanjali if you want a Vedantic perspective. And in fact, the Yoga Sutras compiled by Patanjali are probably, at least in my humble opinion, are probably the most comprehensive spiritual text ever written on this topic. In my view, everything is there. Everything is contained in that book, from the body problem to the mind problem, all the way to the soul problem as well. And basically having very interesting experiences that may result in some realizations about ontological truth. So if that all sounds interesting to you, highly recommend that one in particular, Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Now that brings us to the final piece, the soul problem. Now we can best think of as the soul problem as uncovering the capital T truth about who we really are and about what reality really is. By solving the money problem, which then gives us a greater ability, or done in concert with solving the body and mind problem, we are now in the best position possible, right? If we think of Maslow's hierarchy, we are now at that self-actualization point. We are now on that mountaintop above the clouds. We can see. We are now in the best position possible to direct our time and attention towards this great question of objective, universal, transcendent human purpose. Now, I think it's important to say here that this is a spectrum, right? This isn't necessarily an absolute thing. Progressing towards these big questions is definitely a spectrum, and we're all going to fall. We're all going to have a different appetite for how far we want to go down this road, right? For some of us, it might mean that we just want to get really in touch with our own personal human selves and reap the corresponding benefits with that in our lives. And that's totally, it's totally beneficial. And then for others of us, we might want to try and go as far as we possibly can down this road and try and understand who we really are and what is really going on here. And there's material benefits and metaphysical benefits to be gained along that entire path. Okay, so then it begs the question, well, how do you actually solve the spirit problem, so to speak? How do you actually learn who you really are and what the world really is? Well, that there's a lot of different ways to do that, right? There's a lot of different paths. There's not just one. I mean, every spiritual tradition is basically trying to do some version of that, right? And then there's other things that are not necessarily spiritual traditions that are also trying to do that. not necessarily going to talk about all these different methodologies in this particular video, again, because like the body and mind problem, it's a huge, 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 huge topic that I don't really want to get into right now. But with that being said, I think this could be a good place, maybe just for fun, to give you my best guess, and my best guess as to what I think the greater purpose of human life might be. Because remember, this is not the point of the video for me to do that, but I think it would be fun because I'm also not going to be like to hold that as some like crazy secret that I'm not going to talk about. I think that would be silly. So I could give you my guess for fun and talk a little bit about my own personal experience, right? But to preface that, we might ask the question, well, so who am I to talk about this, right? Where is my perspective on this even coming from? Well, again, I want to reiterate that I'm not special in any way. I think this is all our birthright to know what is going on here, why we're here, right? So I'm not special in that way. But with that being said, I've always been curious about this question, the most curious about this question. It's some of the earliest memories I can possibly remember is me wondering why. Why am I here? What is all of this? I want to know. And so for my entire life, I have wanted to know, and I have tried to make progress on this. And it has basically been, outside the people in my life, the most important thing in my life. But I grew up in a town of less than 5,000 people. And growing up in such a small place, I didn't exactly meet really anyone else who shared my curiosity, I guess you could say. And so I felt a little bit ostracized. I felt like this topic of discussion wasn't exactly welcomed. And so I just decided to more or less keep it to myself and work on this privately. And even, it took me a while even to get to this point where now that we've built this community of like-minded people, this digital tribe of sorts, I guess you could say, now I feel much more comfortable actually having these types of discussions. So I guess I have you to thank a little bit for that. Now, in terms of my past, my teenage years were very pivotal for me personally on this, and that's because that's when I would first be exposed to basically other forms of spiritual traditions outside of the main Western ones. And it was also the point at which I was exposed to meditation. And since then, for the past, I guess, 16 years or so, I've definitely spent well over 1,000 hours in meditation, which is not a lot if you were to talk to a hardcore renunciate temple dweller, right? They've definitely spent more time than that in meditation, I'm sure. But that amount of time in meditation for, a lay person it's a pretty good amount of time. And it's definitely more than enough time to have some very, very interesting experiences and to fundamentally change the way my conscious experience of the world works. So suffice to say, I've devoted a great deal of time and effort to this, perhaps the most deal of time and effort to this out of anything in life. And so another question you may have is, well, what if something like this doesn't exist, right? What if there is no objective meaning of life? What if it is all just subjectivity? What if we do essentially just create our own sources of meaning, that type of thing? Well, first of all, I would say and remember, this is just me personally presenting my view. I'm not saying that this is 100% correct or anything like that. It would be as if we're having a conversation, right? I'm just presenting my view. So my view would be that, well, I think you can dismiss that very quickly by just saying, well, that's a very anthropocentric point of view, right? It's a very human-centric point of view, because that would mean that prior to humans existing and after humans have moved on, that there is no source of meaning in the universe, basically. Okay, well, then you might say, yeah, actually, maybe that is the case. Maybe there isn't one, and and humans, so the only source of meaning that humans can have is to create their own. Okay, fair enough. But then, in my view, I think you can pretty easily dismiss that by basically just looking at the natural laws of the universe, right? The parameters of the universe. Things such as gravity, electromagnetism, thermodynamics. They are all fine-tuned to result in exactly what they have resulted in, right? And so in this way, the parameters of the universe are deterministic. If the universe is a sandbox where seemingly random interactions can happen, played out over a large enough scale, because of the natural laws confining this sandbox, the parameters end up being deterministic. A way more easily to explain this is to just take the example of a fair six-sided die. So a fair six-sided die, when we roll this thing, we imagine that every roll is going to be what we call random. And that's because we don't know what number it's going to be between 1 to 6. It has an equal chance of rolling each number. But played out over a long enough scale, we are going to see that we get an even distribution of all of those numbers through 1 to 6. And the reason we get that is because the parameters of the die are deterministic of the outcome, right? Because it is a fair six-sided die, if we roll it enough times, we are going to know exactly what the outcome is going to be. And so the universe is very much the same way. And to have deterministic parameters is to basically, in my view, basically say that these parameters are teleological. In other words, they have a specific purpose that they are attempting to achieve, right? And a lot of people don't like to have that position, but I see that as a very coherent, logical, and defensible one, right? The point of a system is what it does, okay? So, we have these parameters in the universe that are deterministic, teleological, and a great manifestation of that is evolution. Evolution is clearly a process with a clear purpose. It's an iterative development of biological species, and the goal of each iteration is, a lot of people think of it as, when you view it very simply, it's just simply being to be the fittest in a particular environment, but that's looking at it too myopically. When you zoom out, you can see pretty clearly that evolution on a grand scale is very clearly a process by which you're trying to increase the cognitive and consciousness carrying capacity of species on a particular planet. In other words, result in something like us that continues to progress down that road. And so giving us consciousness, the ability to manipulate and understand our world, is the very clear purpose of evolution. And evolution itself results from these deterministic parameters embedded in the universe itself. And so basically what I'm saying here is there are these natural laws or mechanisms that have come about as a result of these natural laws that are clearly teleological, that are clearly showing us that there is a direction that everything is headed, right? And so that's just some of the reason why I think there is an objective, greater transcendent universal purpose to human life. Now, again, my view, in my humble opinion, I think that in terms of what human purpose would be, I think that non-dualistic Vedanta has the best summarization and formulation and systemization of that. Non-dualistic Vedanta. And basically what they do is they place self-realization as the purpose of human life. And self-realization is the direct experience of knowledge and awareness of who we truly are and what the world truly is. And the direct component there is very important. And the reason the direct component there is very important because there's a big difference between direct and indirect knowledge, right? Philosophers talk about this concept at length. Simply put, if we had something like an apple, if you had never seen an apple before, never tasted one, never touched one, and I tried to explain it to you, or you read about it in a book, you're not going to be able to fully understand what an apple is. You can draw comparisons between other things you might have experienced firsthand, but at the end of the day, you're not going to have a full understanding of what, an experiential understanding of what an apple is. You have to actually have one in your hand. You have to taste it. You have to look at it. That is a direct understanding. You will then have a full understanding of what an apple truly is. And so the goal of non-dualistic Vedanta is to have this type of experience, but not with an apple, with the true nature of reality, a direct experience of knowledge and awareness of what true reality actually is. Plato's allegory of the cave is essentially this too, right? They map together very, very well, and I find that pretty interesting. So me personally, non-dualistic Vedanta is not the only one. I just think of it as the strongest one. I do think that there's a number of things that complement it very well. Particular schools of Buddhism, for example. But that's at least how I've personally defined, I guess what you could say, my foundation stone for my internal value system is as it pertains to the greater purpose of human life. I just wanted to share that for fun as my own personal guess, right? Now, to round out this discussion, because it's a pretty, heavy, big one, I think it's important to say that all of everything we've discussed here isn't to discount normal, mundane human life, right? It's not to discount that at all. In fact, there's a number of good books by Jack Kornfield, in particular, a Buddhist author. He writes a book called A Path with Heart, and he also writes another one called After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. And it's about how to pair both a life where you do concern yourself with these questions, where you are trying to move towards capital T truths and live a life that is more in accordance with your true and authentic self and the corresponding freedom to bring it about. But also, also you got to do the dishes. Also, you got to do the laundry. Also, you got to take stinky poos, right? We have to be able to exist in a world of both. A lot of philosophers see us humans as like this intermediary between gods and animals, right? Aristotle calls us rational animals. We can reach for the stars, but we also have our feet planted firmly on the ground. The Buddha talks about walking the middle way, right? It's this idea that we shouldn't discount or devalue mundane human experience, but maybe rather we should exalt it towards a greater human purpose. And so, in sum, I believe that this question is very worthwhile to attempt to answer. The reason why I think it's very worthwhile to attempt to answer is because the progression towards answering it brings us inevitably to a life where we will understand and be able to live in accordance with our true and authentic selves and have the corresponding freedom to bring it about. The way we can do that is by self-actualizing ourselves. And the way we can self-actualize ourselves is we can solve the 4 problems I've set forth in this sovereign stack idea. We can solve the money problem, the first one, the big one, that the vast majority of everyone gets stuck on, and the one that I will spend a great deal of time focusing on in further discussions. Solve the money problem, solve the body problem, solve the mind problem, solve the soul problem, and, well, that is that, I suppose. I've probably said far too much at this point. And so I think I will leave you there with that. I wish you all the best until we see each other again.